and thanks so much for tuning in to the Scaling People podcast. I'm your host, Rasika Rajagopalan, and today I am so excited to be chatting with Priti Patel, Chief People Officer at G2. Priti is such a strong thought leader in the space, contributing to a variety of publications like Forbes, the Wall Street Journal, and more with best practices and learnings from her time on the ground. For today, I'm really excited to get into the topic of organizational transformation, something that she has had firsthand experience with. So, Preeti, thanks so much for coming on the show.
Happy to be here, Rasika, and thank you for inviting me.
Of course, I'm really excited to jump in. So, let's get into it. The B2B SaaS landscape has evolved pretty quickly over the last few years, whether it be through economic pressures, heightened competition, or shifting customer expectations. And so I'm curious, why do you believe that it's essential for companies to focus on business transformation now? How does prioritizing this impact long-term profitability and resilience, especially in an environment where being agile and adaptable are so key?
Yeah, great context setting question. Because if you've been in tech for a few years, it's like there's this odd, stark contrast from what has happened just a few years ago. And really, what my CFO and I talk about is actually this is a return to normal.
Mm-hmm.
So if you look at charts that show growth to profitability over the last few decades, you can actually see that in 2021, when we were in ZIRP, zero interest rate policy, there was a huge spike of growth to profitability importance. So much so that growth was valued at 8.5x more important than profitability. So it was sort of this growth at all costs time.
Mm-hmm.
And we know that, right? We were fighting in the talent market, we were counter offering on top of counter offering, right? It was crazy. And now you can see, if you look at that same chart, we're back to kind of what the average is, which is about a 1.5. So yes, growth is more valued more than profitability, but not that much more. And this, I really do believe, is a return to normal. So as you think about some of the transformations that you're seeing in tech right now, I actually think it's tech is adjusting back to something that's not going to be gone in the future. I think this is the normal we now need to adapt to.
Yeah, it's so funny how things are cyclic that way and how cultures evolve based on, the things that investors are looking for in that current point in time. And so I'm curious, kind of digging a little bit deeper on this culture piece.
Yeah.
If your culture, sometimes your culture can be a barrier to innovation, sometimes it can be a barrier to transformation. How radical would you be willing to go to change it? Are there aspects of your culture that you'd be prepared to disrupt entirely, or do you recommend organizations work within, the confines of where they are today, to navigate some of those changes?
Well, this might be a little bit of a edgy perspective, but I would say I'd be willing to go as far as changing the very core of what companies are.
Mhm.
And so, what I mean by that is kind of re-examining the core DNA of a company through the lens of two things, really: culture and people. So I'll unpack both. Culture, right? Like the idea of your values, ideally, right? If you set them up right from the beginning, you don't need to reinvent those. It's great when you don't. And I'll say at G2, we're really lucky. We have peak values that actually our co founders started before they knew what G2 was going to be. And those have stood the test of time. Sure, we've had to change the context through which we communicate them, but really, peak, which is performance, entrepreneurial spirit, authenticity, and kindness, are our core pillar values. Now, that's not the case for a lot of peers that I talk to. And now is a time where, in that dramatic cultural change that I mentioned, some are willing. And I think it's the right thing to do to reinvent those values. A famous example you definitely know is Uber in 2017 when it started coming across some toxicity in their culture.
Mhm.
They had to really look at their values, and one of the ones I remember is like toe stepping, and the idea that they had originally said that was meant to be is like you don't have to have a certain title to say what you think and your ideas. Well, that got misconstrued and they had to reinvent their values. So I would say be willing to look at those core things that you would say shouldn't change over time and ideally don't. But in the face of transformation, all things are on the table. So that's culture. On people, this one's a little bit tougher. I would say I'm really inspired by Scaling Up by Vern Harnish. And my favorite quote from that book, he wrote Rockefeller Habits too, if you know that book. Um, my favorite quote is nostalgia is the biggest red flag. And
Mm,
what he means by that is as companies scale, as they go through this major transformation, which G2 has been on this journey, those that cling to what the old days were and really kind of romanticize the early days, it sometimes it comes from within that they realize, hey, it might be time for me to go.
mhm,
Sometimes they don't, and those are tough conversations. But I think that those conversations and decisions have to be surfaced because what ends up happening in those situations, in my experience, is it's actually a complete win win when you unlock those really tough confrontations and realizations. So I'd say those are the two that I'd say like be willing to change both. And then there's maybe the a how to this answer, which is be willing to change how you communicate all
mm,
the way to the most transparent levels, even if it feels uncomfortable. I don't know of an example, Rasika. I was thinking about this question before. I don't know of an example where transparency has caused a bad outcome. Now,
mm,
sure, it's transparency within reason, but being able to communicate the why and do it
mhm.
as early as possible, to me, in my experience, brings people in. It helps people co create results and really builds trust.
Yeah, I love that you touched on all of those different aspects of it because I do think it's very multifaceted. A lot of times, I think culture is communicated as a way that employees work together that's separate from your actual outcomes. But I think some of the examples that you shared, really reflect how important they are in helping you get from point A to point B to point C. One thing that came to mind is a lot of times when you think of this concept of first mover advantage, companies that were the ones that started, you would expect that, oh, every company that had a head start would be the one that today is the most successful. But when I look back at a lot of these companies and their competitors that maybe cropped up years later, it's not always the case. Sometimes it's the companies that cropped up years later that are much more successful. And again, I think it comes back down to that culture of innovation,
Yeah,
challenging the status quo. Even Netflix and Blockbuster, I think, is an
sure.
interesting
Famous
example where,
example.
yeah, where Blockbuster had been around for a number of years, but just that culture of adaptability, Netflix has done a really good job of continuing to adapt with the needs of what consumers demand. So yeah, it's really important to continue to critically think about, are the behaviors in the organization serving the needs of tomorrow, and how can we continue to shift them? So you talked a little bit about people, which is such an important part of all of this. How do you approach identifying skill gaps within your organization? Are there tools or frameworks that you found effective to assess the current capabilities that you have versus the needs you're going to have in the future? How do you know whether to reskill or upskill? Yeah, what criteria do you use to make that assessment?
Yeah. So funny you mentioned Netflix because one of our core inspirations is actually Netflix. And we all, as a executive leadership team, a few years ago now, read the book No Rules Rules and really kind of thought about, all right, this aligns to our peak values. It makes tons of sense from a performance driven standpoint. So many aspects of it resonated. And we knew that we wanted to be data driven. And so we've taken kind of inspiration from there and built what I'd say is kind of our own analytics model of
Mm,
how we measure our people from very different aspects. So I'll explain. We call it talent density, as Netflix does, but we use an approach that takes both 9 box, so performance and potential, their average weighted score in performance. And then this year, actually, funny anecdote on this, I was telling this to researchers who are writing a book on successful CEOs, and they were interviewing Godard Abel, our CEO and founder, and they were fascinated by this. So they said, "You're missing one thing, Preeti." And I'm like, what are we missing? And so we're adding this year criticality of the role.
Mm.
It adds a whole nother dimension of how you think about your people and how to assess skills, which is what you're getting at. And when we look at that numerically as one single number, it allows us to do so many different things. It allows us to capacity plan. It allows us to intervene as needed and earlier. And for the CPOs that are listening, it also allows for us to talk to our board in a language that is compelling to them. So I'm able to translate performance, which is a very HR concept, to OpEx. And that is an ability that we did not have before we rolled out this analytical approach. So just new this year, to your point of like, how do we think about reskilling for the future? We have rolled out workforce planning. And I will say, I'm not going to come on this podcast and say, you have to do workforce planning the way that, the frameworks would suggest you do. I would say, though, you have to be really thoughtful about planning for your workforce in a way that meets you where you're at in your state.
Mhm. Mhm.
And so what that is for us is we sit down with our executive leadership team. We look at all the data we have on our people and we say, all right, based on the goals and based on our financial plan, what are the skills that we need? What are the skills we have? And it's a simple gap assessment there. And then the lens that we add, which I can't take credit for this. This is something that I was inspired by a partner at KPMG in India that I met not too long ago when I was in India. She kind of gave us this lens of, all right, if you find that you have skills you need just for the next 12 months, don't hire it, contract it. If
Mhm.
it's 24 months, think about, can you borrow that within your organization? Can you maybe train those skills within or shift some resources, gig assignments, something that we do already at G2. And if it's 36 months, all right, then you think about hiring. And what that does, that framework, it really starts to expand how you think about resourcing. And I know we're going to talk about AI, like that's another element, right?
Mhm.
Is there a way you can augment capacity when you're looking at it with the lens of how long do you actually need this resource to achieve the goals you're setting out to do?
Hmm. Yeah, I think that's so helpful because I think a lot of times with, I think the saying spray and pray, like with people,
Yeah.
we have this problem, let's just hire this person, they're going to figure it out. But I think putting that critical lens on what is this person going to be doing for the next 3 years is such a forcing function for you to have a strategic plan in place to even be able to have that conversation.
Can I
Yeah, and then,
can I
oh,
add two
sorry, go
more
ahead.
things there?
Yeah.
It, spray and pray, right? Like it's like this human psychological standpoint of like, I have it in my budget, and so I need to hire it because if I don't hire it, I don't get that resource. We as people leaders have to encourage and coach managers that is scarcity thinking, and we have to kind of lift the constraints there. And I think where that comes from is being willing to solve it in a different way so that
Mhm.
they're not thinking that, a breathing body is better than no body, right? You've heard that saying, I'm sure. And so
Mhm.
I think that's a really common pitfall. And then another thing that people overlook when they're doing workforce planning is, what do the individuals want? And so something I really recommend, and we do here at G2, is we call them peak development plans. And we know for each employee, what is their long-term career vision? What are the things that they want to develop? Because it is a jigsaw puzzle, right? Like it's what we need, but it's also what employees need. And if we can make those matches, that's when there is a total win-win for growth.
Yeah, definitely. And, especially in the era that we've had over the last, let's call it 3 or 4 years, where companies have done a lot of restructuring and a lot of reduction. In some cases, I do feel like there's, for certain individuals, a numbness to, okay, well, like we can hire this person on. I know what they're going to do in a year. Maybe I know what they're going to do in two. If things don't work out, I can go ahead and eliminate the role. But that's where I do think the gig economy or the contract component becomes so important and valuable, because aside from all of the, all of the moral implications of bringing someone on, what that means if you don't even know if they're going to have a job in a year or whatever, there's a lot of trust building that you lose with the team. There are the downstream effects of just the change. You're bringing someone on, they're really invested, you pull them out. I mean, these things are never seamless transitions. So I think, yeah, really thinking critically about what does the business need for the next year, 2 or 3, and also being in a position to do that. I think a lot of executives, because maybe you haven't been able to make the right investments in middle management or your layer below, you're not even able to think 3 years ahead. You're only thinking 6 months or a year ahead because you're so embedded. So there are lots of layers, I think, to enable you to set yourself up to be able to think through that 3-year horizon that ultimately helps you kind of make these decisions.
That's right.
So much in there. Yeah. Tell me a little bit about AI. So, I mean, obviously with AI, it's, throwing a spin on the skills that are going to become relevant over the next, 2, 3, 10 years and beyond. And so, yeah, how do you identify which skills are going to be most relevant in the future? And what steps do you think organizations can take to foster more of this culture of continuous learning and adaptability? Since, it truly is going to be hard to fully predict what person A is going to be doing in their job over the next 3 years.
Great topic, and there's no podcast that's complete without talking about AI these days. So
Can't wait to
I'm
play
glad
all
you're
these
throwing
back
that.
in like 5 years and just see what happened. I can't wait.
Right, like how right were we? I'll give credit to Tim Sanders. He's our VP of Research Insights. He just posted something on this. So McKinsey has kind of positioned how to think about AI in two ways. Either it's the replacement model, and this is specifically in sales and marketing, but I think it's applicable here in general. Replacement model, AI is going to come in and literally replace people because it can do the job of multiple people. Or there's another way to look at it, which is capacity, which is it's going to augment one's ability to do their job, and therefore they can do more. And that is really exciting because not only can they do more, they can likely do more that requires human intervention, things like, that requires creative thinking, that requires emotional intelligence in a way that AI just can. And so we're kind of moving resources, human resources, us, upstream to the more challenging, more exciting sides of our jobs, right? So I would say start there. Let's frame it, because naturally, with anything new like this, there's natural fear in the system, right? Is this going to replace my job? So let's just debunk that from the beginning. And that's something that I would recommend organizations do. Secondly, kind of set up the infrastructure. So the scaffolding, how does it connect back to things like your values, things like your employer brand, and what you really kind of talk about in what is important in all employees at a company, and create moments where you can celebrate that. So just similarly like that, our values, I'll give you an example. We have our peak values, and we have moments throughout our employee experience that celebrate that. So we have peak awards that we celebrate at our town halls. We highlight stories at our town halls of people going above and beyond. Similarly, we've done the same thing for AI and added it to. We use the V2 Mom as our goal setting. It is a goal on our V2 Mom. We then also kind of create this. We're hybrid, 40% hybrid organization, and so Slack is where we talk. We have a channel where it's called 10% more. What are examples or stories where you've gone 10% more and above because of AI? And so when you start to create the infrastructure like this, I think it really kind of raises that awareness. All right, now third, how do you also train your people? This is new and no one really knows how to embrace it. And so in the last year, we've invested in trainings within G2. We've invested in kind of corporate memberships to AI tools. And then we've also said to all of our executive team, you should be investing in AI. It's one of our fastest growing categories on G2. We have to keep up, not only for our own sake as a company, but that's where our customers are going. So the use case for us, there's a lot of them, but one of the coolest ones that I love is we use AI for sourcing or for screening inbound applicants. And something that would take normally 2 to 3 days now can take us 8 hours or 2 to 3 hours. And the
Mhm.
reason is we get 500 applicants per role. And so we can do that seamlessly. And that is just a huge time saver, but without sacrificing quality. And so by enforcing kind of and embracing this idea, I think that there's a lot you can kind of do from that. But at the end, I would say mindset matters. I think that the people that are going to embrace AI and are embracing it are those that are continuously of growth mindset. They know that they want to learn and are hungry for that. And that comes way before, how do you roll out AI at a company? That's how do you screen employees to join your company, and something that luckily we've kind of built into our interview process.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it feels like we're on the second stage of AI adoption. Stage one, I felt like it was unclear. Are you cheating? Are you not cheating by using this to do this thing? And now we're on stage two, where people, I think, are starting to understand that no, 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 this technology is here to enable you. If you move less quickly than somebody else because they're using technology to make themselves more efficient, then, that's actually the expectation. And so I think we're sort of sorting through the dozens of tools that are being thrown at us and trying to figure out which ones are actually driving productivity versus maybe not. And I think we're going to reach stage three at some point where everybody's using it. There's a norm and it's kind of baseline. But I think a big part at our organization from navigating from stage one to stage two is and with any sort of new concept, is leadership also showing that they are very open to learning and investing in learning
Yeah.
together. And so, we did AI hackathons where every team would have to, compete and sort of find ways to integrate AI into their job. And it was just cool to be like, well, we don't really know, but we're all just trying and seeing, how we can leverage something new, or just generally, as leaders talking about how you continue to maintain your ongoing mentorship relationships or what you're doing for continuous learning. Because yeah, to your point, if predicting what the needs are going to be over the next 2 to 3 years are so important, with time warping up as fast as it is, I mean, it's just getting harder and harder to predict what the needs of the businesses are going to be over that
Exactly.
time period.
Which
So
is which is why I over index on the mindset. Because if you get the hunger for learning, I'm actually less worried about what needs to be learned. It's the energy and appetite to do that. Because you're right, if no one knows, right?
mhm, mhm.
There's always a new tool that's cropping up that we can use, and so it's how do we really find those that have that entrepreneurial spirit, which is one of our core values.
Yeah, definitely. Well, as I'm sure you felt in various degrees, organizations are just always in this constant state of transformation. So, how do you combat transformation fatigue, especially for employees that have been at the company for, a while, that are just a little bogged down by a lot of this continuous change? So, how do you protect employee well-being while also pushing for rapid change and evolution?
Yeah. Can I say I think transformation needs a rebrand? I think that we need to turn it on its head. Like, it's transformation in and of itself makes it sound like it's a one-time thing
Mhm.
or it's a every few year thing. I think that's done. I don't think that's the norm anymore. I think that change, and not to be cliche, but it's true, change is the only constant. And
That's
so
right.
how do we, again, back to the mindset and setting expectations, how do we reframe that whole question? Because I'll take an example that's unrelated to work. I'm a mother of two young children, 3.5 and 1.5 years, two boys. They are rambunctiously crazy. Okay. And every day, if I were to tell myself, I am going to get through this day and at some point there will be stability, I'm set up for failure. It's done. I'm done with. And I'm sure the parents out there are laughing like it, like I look over 1 second they're fine and the next one is pushing the other over and the other's crying and who knows if there's a bloody nose, right? Like our perspective in that moment matters so much more than anything of the content. We call this in conscious leadership the context. How am I approaching this issue versus the actual content, the problem at hand? And if we can train that, I really feel that this idea of fatigue is almost like one of yesterday. So that's thing one. Thing two, yes, well being is super, super important. And we have invested a lot of time to make sure that there are benefits that meet folks where they are at in terms of what they need. I think I saw Katie Burke on your podcast not too long ago. Hey, Katie, it was one of my first meet and greets when I started in this role. But really what she talked about is like, yeah, we have a responsibility to offer that. And G2 is not any different. We have not only in our health insurance plans that is mental health is covered and offered, we also have a lifestyle wellness program where you can kind of have the freedom to choose where you spend those funds on how you define well-being. So we've had people learn how to swim for the first time, learn guitar, go to hiking, national parks. So that for sure is there, but I'd say all of that is secondary to what I started with, which is let's shift this context a little. I don't think we ever get to a good place if we talk about transformation being something that we finish and check off our list.
Yeah, that's such a good framing. And you're absolutely right. It's only going to be more and more a part of the day to day, the hour to hour. And that's why building that adaptability and resilience muscle, I think, is going to be so incredibly important. And so, going a little bit more specific to your experience, I'm wondering if you could share a time where a transformation effort didn't go as planned. Are there any lessons that you learned from that, felt like could inform your future reskilling and leadership strategies, or something more tangible to take the theoretical conversation we've had and put it to something with something more specific?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, and what you were getting at too in that last question, leaders also have to change how they lead through
Hmm.
transformation. And so the idea of filling our own cup is so important.
Hmm.
So this example, I'll say, I'm still putting my own oxygen mask on this one. And I hope some of our employees listen to this because I don't know that I've ever even said this internally to our company. But a couple of years ago, actually, when I started, I went on a listening tour. I talked to hundreds of our employees, and I would hear kind of two things that really needed to happen. We needed to invest more in DEI, which I'm very proud we did that. And the other, which I'll talk about, is pay transparency.
Yeah.
Our employees, I think, had been maybe promised by the previous leadership that this was coming, and it was sort of something I inherited. And so I came in and of course wanting to meet people where they're at. I'm like, well, if this is what people are asking for, like let's be employee led like we are in so many different things. And of course the laws were changing and we were already pointing towards a place where transparency was needed. So we went on this multi-year journey. All the advice I got was just rip the band-aid off and just go for it. So we started with building our leveling framework, which we didn't have, standardizing job description, didn't have that. Then thinking about, okay, what is our pay philosophy? Did all of that work? And all the while, employees are like, we've been asking for this. You keep saying it's coming. When is it coming? Right. And little did they know that we had to do all this work,
Yeah.
build towards that. Right. So last year, finally, we get to a point where, all right, we got our leveling framework, we got our pay philosophy. We now have pay ranges for every single job at G2. We go to roll it out and we bring managers in and they're like, wait, you want me to have this conversation? You want me to tell the employees where they sit in their range and have that difficult, awkward, disappointing conversation? Like, yeah, like,
Yeah.
do you think we're gonna do that? Like, what is the expectation? So that was a total miss on our part, which was, wow, our managers are scared. Like
Hmm.
underneath all of that was
Mm.
managers are scared, right? This is big. This is a huge change. And so we delayed the program to many people's disappointment. I heard a lot about that in the EMPS. And we probably rattled some trust there because people thought it just was never going to come. But what we did is invested another 6 to 9 months, I believe, really making sure managers felt ready. And I'm talking like mock practices, like talk to me like I'm at the bottom of the range, and how are you going to handle that? And really
Mm.
making them feel comfortable. And ultimately, we did roll it out last year. And why I say still putting my oxygen mask on, like the results are mixed.
Mm-hmm.
On one hand, I would say employees are like, okay, you did it, thank you, we appreciate that. Although I don't know if I ever heard the thank you, but it's okay. Something that goes unthanked is probably a thank you. I'm sure you could relate.
Yeah.
And then some are like, wow, this was an unexpected one. Wow, now that I'm in a range. So I can't exceed the range? Like what has
Mm.
why did this feel
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
amazing? And so it's really fascinating. And what I'd say to anyone who's on this journey, if you feel like this is a really challenging, complex initiative, it is. And what I would say, and this is something that I told our team that was working on this day in, day out, is the why is so important. And we are a company built literally on transparency, trusted, authentic reviews on software. Now at like what 2.8 million reviews, 90 million people come to G2 to trust reviews. We got to do that too internally. And so even though it's hard, I know we're doing the right thing, and there have been many bumps in the road. So I hope that's a
Oh my
real
goodness.
specific
Yes.
example for you.
I so appreciate you sharing that. Couple nuggets that come to mind.
Yeah.
One, I am so glad. Well, there are lots of different types of initiatives where sometimes moving fast is the right call when you don't have the details fully fleshed out. There are some where it's really worth spending the time, and I think comp is one of those, which is so deeply personal and so deeply complex that I think it makes sense to make sure that you have all of the questions ironed out. We talked earlier about transparency and it being good and whatever. And I agree. And I think we both agree that there's good transparency, but there's also bad transparency, which is when you share information without a lot of context, the proper prep, without people knowing how to answer questions like, what does this mean for me? So that extra layer to take it from transparency to really good transparency, I think is well worth it. The other piece that I've heard from lots of HR leaders through some of the unstable years we've had with rifts and restructuring is I've heard stories where, HR leaders are the ones that have to go up on stage and tell the company that we're doing these layoffs without the CEO stepping in and sharing a lot of the strategic decisioning and thinking. And I think it's important that HR isn't just the voice that has to have the tough conversations, that you're an enabler to having discussions and preparing different stakeholders to managing their piece of that dialogue. But I think it's important that you empowered your managers, because ultimately that's what increases your own leverage. Like when you're actually able to train all of your managers to be able to have this dialogue and to also just deeply understand it, they can also be champions and advocates, right, for why you've chose to structure it a certain way. So such a great example. I
Yeah.
appreciate it.
Yeah. And luckily, in that nugget there, I do have to shout out our CEO, because he was and always is in any rifts that we've had or restructures or M&A, always by my side. And I know that's not always the case. So I do feel lucky. And I would say if you're in a position where you don't have that and feel that, that's worth a difficult conversation, or just
Totally.
kind of looking at what you are expecting in that.
Yeah, for sure. Well, to wrap, I'd love to just ask you, in this example and other examples, sometimes transformation efforts go really well. Sometimes there's a trial and error iterative process. So
Yeah.
how do you prevent a culture of blame from emerging when initiatives fail? Like how do you encourage a mindset of experimentation and innovation without some of the finger pointing and, just blame emerging when things, don't go as planned?
Yeah. I think I've mentioned it maybe a couple times now. Conscious leadership is something
Mm-hmm.
that is very integral to our culture. Um, I don't know that it matters what framework you use as a means to getting to what I'm describing here, but I'd say pick a framework, and ours is conscious leadership. And what one of the tenets, the core tenets of it is taking 100% responsibility for the conditions you create in your life. And what that means is you are responsible for your experience in life. And if we were to take that down a level here to answer your question, take 100% responsibility instead of blaming others, instead of blaming something outside of yourself for what you're experiencing. And with that comes this ability, unlocks really this ability to just have really candid conversations.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and I think your principles also apply really well to blaming external environments too, whether it's the macro environment, the
Yeah.
market, whatever it is. At the end of the day, there's things that are in our sphere of control and things that aren't, and focusing on what we can control and how we can hold ourselves accountable despite all of the things that are, forces against or for us, I think is so important. So, Preeti, always a pleasure. So many great takeaways. So thank you again for taking the time to sharing your learnings. Until next time.